They mocked the Soviet tin planes until they ruled the skies June 27, 1941. Somewhere over the churning dust and smoke of the Eastern Front, Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann pressed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a steep climb, scanning the horizon for the enemy aircraft his squadron leader had just reported. What he saw made him laugh. 5 Soviet aircraft lumbered toward the German convoy below, clumsy, primitive things that looked like they'd been cobbled together in a tractor factory. They were slow, they were ugly, and within 6 days, 55 of 65 would be shot down or destroyed. But Klaus Hartmann would live long enough to stop laughing. In the 3 years that followed, these tin planes would become the most produced military aircraft in history. Over 36,000 would roll off Soviet assembly lines. They would destroy thousands of German tanks, kill tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, and earn a nickname that would haunt the German army all the way to Berlin. The Germans called them Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. By December 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers were writing home with words that contradicted every assumption of German superiority. The Soviet Union wasn't supposed to have an industrial base. Their aircraft weren't supposed to be threats. Their pilots weren't supposed to survive. Every intelligence assessment said so. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, had written in his diary before Barbarossa commenced that the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. The Luftwaffe's own intelligence officers reported that Soviet aircraft production capacity was primitive, their designs inferior, their crews inadequately trained. It seemed reasonable. The Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority over Poland in 3 days, over France in 3 weeks. Their pilots were veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of Britain. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, were technological marvels, fast and deadly. The Soviet Air Force, by contrast, had been crippled by Stalin's purges. Experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned. Tactical doctrine was in disarray. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Germans destroyed 1,800 Soviet aircraft on the first day alone. By the end of the first week, 4,000 Soviet aircraft were smoldering wreckage. The Luftwaffe pilots reported easy victories, sitting ducks, obsolete biplanes that couldn't maneuver, couldn't fight back. Among the few new aircraft types the Soviets fielded was something called the Il-2 Sturmovik. Stormbird, they called it. The Germans had another name, Betonflugzeug. Concrete plane. It was not a compliment. October 1939, 2 years before Klaus Hartmann would climb into his Bf 109 over the Eastern Front. Sergei Ilyushin stood in a Moscow hangar staring at blueprints that every aviation expert in the Soviet Union had called impossible. A flying tank. That's what Stalin wanted. Not metaphorically, literally a tank that could fly. Aircraft were supposed to be light, armor was heavy. The two concepts were fundamentally incompatible. Every engineer knew this, but Ilyushin had an idea that would rewrite the rules. Instead of adding armor plating to an existing airframe, what if the armor itself was the airframe? What if the steel shell wasn't protection bolted on afterward? What if it was the load-bearing structure of the aircraft itself? The Central Design Bureau gave him 2 prototypes to prove it. The first Il-2 lifted off in October 1939. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, 3,000 pounds heavier than the German Stuka dive bomber. The armor, 5 to 12 millimeters of special alloy steel, encased the cockpit, engine, fuel tanks, and radiators in a single integrated shell. Even the windscreen was armored glass, 6 centimeters thick. The weight penalty was severe. The original design had been a 2-seater, pilot and rear gunner working together. But with all that armor, the aircraft was too heavy, too slow, too ungainly. Ilyushin made a calculated decision: remove the rear gunner, remove his seat, his gun, his armor protection. Save £700, make the Il-2 faster, more maneuverable, more likely to survive encounters with German fighters. It was a compromise that would cost thousands of Soviet lives. But in early 1941, with production finally beginning and the aircraft entering service, no one yet understood what was coming. The Il-2 that Klaus Hartmann mocked on June 27, 1941, carried two 20mm Shevaki cannons and two 7.62mm HKS machine guns in its wings. It could carry up to 1,320 pounds of bombs or 8 RS-82 rockets. Its Michelin AM-38 engine produced 1,600 horsepower. Maximum speed, 255 miles per hour. By comparison, Hartmann's Bf-109F could hit 390 miles per hour. The Soviet plane was slower, less agile, designed for a completely different mission. While German fighters sought air superiority through dogfighting, the Il-2 was built for one purpose: ground attack, flying low, hunting tanks. The Germans had their own ground attack aircraft, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. It had proven devastatingly effective in Poland and France, screaming down in near-vertical dives to deliver bombs with terrifying precision. But the Stuka had a critical weakness: its armor protection was minimal. When faced with competent fighter opposition or concentrated anti-aircraft fire, Stukas died. The Battle of Britain had proven this. Stuka losses became so severe that they were withdrawn from daylight operations over England. The Il-2 took a different approach. It wouldn't dive from altitude. It would come in low, sometimes at 20 meters, barely above treetop level. It would absorb punishment that would shred a Stuka, and it would keep flying. June 22, 1941. The 4th Aviation Assault Regiment received its allocation of Il-2 Sturmovix just days before the German invasion. 65 aircraft. The pilots had minimal training. Some had never fired the Il-2's weapons. Ground crews had never serviced them. Tactical doctrine, the coordinated methods that would eventually make the Sturmovik devastating, didn't exist yet. When the panzers came, the 4th Regiment threw everything at them. They flew low, attacking in groups of 3 to 5 aircraft. They came in fast, fired their weapons, dropped their bombs, and tried to escape before German fighters could react. In the first 3 days, 10 Il-2s were lost to enemy fire. 19 more were lost to pilot error or mechanical failure. The surviving pilots were learning on the job, and the tuition was paid in blood. By June 28th, only 10 Il-2s remained operational. Klaus Hartmann and his fellow Bf-109 pilots found them easy prey. The single-seat Il-2 had no rear defense. German fighters would position themselves behind the Soviet attackers, out of the armored shell's protection, and pour 20mm cannon fire into the unarmored wooden tail section. The rear fuselage would disintegrate, control surfaces would fail. The Il-2 would spiral into the ground, armored tub intact, but the aircraft dead nonetheless. Luftwaffe pilots developed a clinical efficiency: attack from behind and above, aim for the tail, avoid the armored nose. The Il-2 earned its nickname, concrete bomber, hard to kill from the front, helpless from the rear. But what the German pilots celebrating their easy victories didn't know was that 500 miles to the east, Soviet factories were already moving. When the Wehrmacht's advance threatened Moscow and the industrial centers of Western Russia, Stalin ordered a massive evacuation. Entire factories were dismantled. Machinery was loaded onto trains. Workers and engineers traveled east of the Ural Mountains to Kuibyshev and other cities beyond the reach of German bombers. The Il-2 production lines went silent for 2 months. In that time, the Germans came within sight of Moscow. They believed the Soviet Union was finished. Stalin did not agree. In the autumn of 1941, as German tanks approached Moscow and the Red Army bled to hold them back, Stalin composed a telegram. It was addressed to Schenkman and Tretyakov, the managers of the Il-2 production facilities. "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture Il-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs Il-2 aircraft, like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces one Il-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds 1 or 2 MiG-3s daily. It is a mockery of our country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience and demand that you manufacture more Ils. This is my final warning. Stalin." Production increased. By October 1942, Soviet factories were producing 1,000 Il-2s per month. But numbers alone weren't enough. The Il-2's vulnerability to rear attack remained a fatal flaw. Soviet pilots knew it. Every mission briefing included the same grim math. In the spring and summer of 1942, one Il-2 was lost for every 24 combat sorties. During the Battle of Stalingrad, that ratio worsened to one loss every 10 to 12 missions. The crews were dying faster than they could be replaced. An Il-2 pilot wrote directly to Stalin. His letter was brief, desperate, and to the point. "Comrade Stalin, we need a rear gunner to defend against enemy fighters. Without one, we are flying coffins." Stalin read the letter, and he ordered Ilyushin to redesign the aircraft. By March 1942, a new variant was flying, the Il-2M two-seater. The fuselage was extended slightly to accommodate a second crew member. A 12.7 mm UBT heavy machine gun was mounted in a rear-facing position. The gunner sat behind the pilot, separated by the fuel tank, operating the weapon from a small canvas sling in a partially open cockpit. He had no armor protection. Winter missions in that rear position were brutally cold. Summer missions left the gunner exposed to the elements and to German fire. Rear gunners suffered 4 times the fatality rate of pilots. Many were drawn from penal battalions, men who had committed infractions against Soviet military discipline and were given a chance to redeem themselves. Or die trying. Parachutes were not always provided. Training consisted of a few hours with the machine gun. Life expectancy was measured in sorties. But the rear gun changed the equation. German fighters could no longer attack from behind with impunity. The 12.7 mm UBT could damage or destroy a Bf-109. Luftwaffe pilots had to be more cautious, more tactical, and that gave the Il-2 pilots time to do their job. July 5, 1943, Battle of Kursk. The largest tank battle in history was about to begin. The Germans had assembled 2,700 tanks, including the new Panther and Tiger models designed specifically to counter Soviet armor. They had 1,800 aircraft. They had 800,000 men. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's plan was simple. Twin pincers, north and south. Crush the Soviet salient at Kursk. Destroy the Red Army's armored reserves. Turn the tide of the war. The Germans believed they would succeed. Their intelligence reports indicated that Soviet air power was weakening. Pilot quality was declining. Aircraft losses were unsustainable. What German intelligence didn't know was that the Soviet VVS had more than 2,800 Il-2 Sturmovix available. And the tactics that had failed so disastrously in 1941 had evolved. Soviet researchers at the Aviation Armament Scientific Testing Firing Range had studied every engagement, analyzed every failure, tested every theory. They had learned: attack from higher altitude, not 20 meters but 300. Make multiple passes, not hit and run, but sustained assault. Use each weapon system in a separate pass. First pass, rockets. Second pass, bombs. Third pass, cannon and machine gun strafing. And most importantly, mutual defense, the circle of death. The Soviets called it the defensive circle. The Germans would come to call it something else. 8 Il-2s would form a circular formation over a target, spaced 150 to 200 meters apart, banking at 15 to 40 degrees. Each aircraft protected the one ahead with its forward-firing guns. One by one, each Il-2 would peel away from the circle, attack the target, then rejoin the formation. The circle could remain over a target for 20 minutes or more, until ammunition was exhausted, until the target was destroyed. German fighters attempting to break the formation found themselves in a crossfire. Attack one Il-2 and 7 others had firing solutions on you. The tactic worked. On July 5, 1943, as Manstein's panzers began their advance, the first Il-2 formations appeared over the German armor. But the weapon that changed everything wasn't rockets or cannons. It was a 3-pound bomblet. PTAB, Protivo-tankovaya aviaционная bomba, anti-tank aviation bomb, shaped charge, designed to penetrate the thin top armor of German tanks. A single Il-2 could carry 192 of them in 4 cassettes. Released at 320 feet altitude, they would blanket an area 230 feet long and 50 feet wide. The Germans had no defense. Their tanks' top armor, designed to resist artillery striking from horizontal angles, was vulnerable to vertical attack. 8 to 12 millimeters of steel plate. A PTAB could penetrate up to 70 millimeters. When Il-2 formations appeared over the 9th Panzer Division on July 7, 1943, they carried PTABs. 20 minutes later, 70 German tanks were burning. German tank commanders reported a new level of psychological devastation. The sound of Il-2s approaching, the whistle of bomblets falling, the crack of shaped charges punching through armor, the screams of burning men, and there was nowhere to hide. German commanders ordered dispersal. Tanks spread out, increasing the distance between vehicles to reduce the effectiveness of cluster weapons. But that made them vulnerable to individual attack. The Il-2s adapted. By mid-July 1943, German ground forces were reporting a phenomenon they hadn't experienced before. Air supremacy was shifting. The Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots, still had capable aircraft. But they were outnumbered. And the aircraft they were facing, those concrete bombers they had mocked in 1941, were no longer easy prey. Obergefreiter Hans Richter crouched in his foxhole near Prokhorovka, July 12, 1943. He was writing a letter home. His hands were shaking. "Mutti, I don't know how to describe what I saw today. The Russian aircraft came in waves. They circle above like vultures. One attacks, then another, then another. Our flak guns fire until they're glowing red, but the planes keep coming. I saw 3 Il-2s shot down this morning. All 3 pilots bailed out. 2 landed behind our lines. Our soldiers shot them immediately, not because of orders, because of hate. These pilots have killed so many of us. They destroyed Hauptmann Weber's tank platoon yesterday. 8 Panthers, gone in 15 minutes. We used to laugh at Soviet aircraft. We don't laugh anymore. We call them Schwarzer Tod now, Black Death, and we run when we hear them coming." Richter's letter was intercepted after his death 3 days later. Soviet intelligence analysts found it in a batch of captured mail. It was translated, circulated, used in propaganda to show that German morale was cracking, but it was also evidence of something the numbers alone couldn't capture. The Il-2 had achieved something beyond tactical effectiveness. It had achieved psychological dominance. The statistics told part of the story. In July 1943 at Kursk, more than 750 Il-2s operated on the front lines. Luftwaffe intelligence reported shooting down 6,900 Soviet aircraft in 1943. Many of those were Il-2s. But Soviet factories were producing them faster than the Germans could destroy them. For every Il-2 lost, another was already being built in Kuibyshev. or one of the other eastern factories. By late 1943, the Il-2M3 variant entered service. The rear gunner now had 13 millimeters of armor protection. The wings had been redesigned with swept leading edges to correct the center of gravity problems caused by the rear gunner's weight. The AM-38F engine produced 1,750 horsepower. Cannon armament was upgraded from 20mm to 23mm VYA-23 high-velocity weapons. The German pilots noticed. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, the same pilot who had laughed at the Il-2 on June 27, 1941, was still alive in late 1943. He was one of the survivors. Most of his squadron from 1941 was dead. In his logbook, he recorded a combat engagement on November 18, 1943. Engaged formation of 8 Il-2s near Zhytomyr. Approached from above, attempted to attack rear aircraft. Rear gunner opened fire at 400 meters, 20mm strikes on my port wing. Broke off attack. Observed 2 FW-190s engaging the same formation. One shot down by concentrated defensive fire. These are not the same aircraft we faced in 1941. The crews are experienced, the tactics are sound, and there are always more of them. 3 months later, Klaus Hartmann's Bf-109 was shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. He survived. He was captured. In a post-war interrogation, he was asked about the Il-2. His response was recorded. We called it the flying tank. Concrete plane, Iron Gustav. The names were not jokes, they were descriptions. You couldn't kill them easily. You had to be smart, patient, precise, and even then they kept coming. By 1944, we were outnumbered 5-1 in the air. Every mission was defensive. We were trying to stop them from destroying our tanks, our trucks, our trains. We were losing. The Il-2 was a crude aircraft by our standards, but it worked. And they built 36,000 of them. That's why we lost the war. January 26, 1943, Malorossiyskaya train station, Southern Soviet Union. 2 Il-2s approached at treetop level, flying up a ravine to avoid detection. They climbed at the last moment, banking hard over the crest of the hill. Below them, 4 German supply trains, packed with fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements desperately needed at Stalingrad. The first Il-2 released a salvo of RS-82 rockets. The second followed with bombs. Explosions tore through the trains, fuel ignited, ammunition cooked off. The station itself was engulfed in fire. The tracks were so badly damaged they couldn't be repaired. The trains couldn't move forward, and with Soviet forces advancing, they couldn't move back. All 4 trains were captured intact days later. Inside them, German personnel records documenting the scale of the losses at Stalingrad. The Germans were starving, out of ammunition, out of hope, and 2 Il-2s had just cut another supply line. Stalin read the after-action report. He issued an order. Continue attacks on German rail transport. Disrupt their preparations for Kursk. The Il-2 is essential. Build more. Vasily Emelianenko climbed into his Il-2 for the 92nd time in June 1942. He had been shot down twice already. Both times, the armored tub had saved his life. This mission was a strike against a German airfield near Artemovsk in eastern Ukraine. His formation, 6 Il-2s, flew low up a ravine, engines throttled back to reduce noise. They banked left, climbing hard, and suddenly the airfield was below them. 2 rows of German bombers parked neatly on the tarmac. Emelianenko armed his rockets, lowered his nose, and heard a deafening crack. A German flak shell had torn a hole in his right wing, 18 inches across. He could see through it. The aircraft shuddered, but stayed airborne. He squeezed the trigger. 8 RS-82 rockets streaked down toward the bombers. Fire erupted across the airfield. His machine guns followed, strafing runs that set 3 more aircraft ablaze. He pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and headed for Soviet lines. The engine was running rough, oil pressure was dropping, the aircraft was vibrating, trailing smoke. He nursed it 40 kilometers before the engine seized. He crash-landed in a field. German infantry found him. They fired machine pistols, the bullets kicking up dirt around him as he crawled towards Soviet lines. It took 2 hours to crawl 200 yards. A Soviet soldier found him, pulled him to safety. Emelianenko's Il-2 had absorbed multiple hits: flak, small arms, the catastrophic damage to the wing, and brought him home. He flew 89 more missions before the war ended. Each time, he climbed into an aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as primitive, crude, ineffective. Each time, he came back alive. By the end of the war, he was a hero of the Soviet Union. His Il-2 had been shot to pieces and repaired so many times that no original panels remained, but it still flew. The German Wehrmacht's assessments of the Il-2's effectiveness were contradictory. Tank commanders often claimed that Il-2 attacks were more psychological than physical. In one famous example at Kursk, Soviet Il-2 pilots claimed 270 tank kills against the 3rd Panzer Division. The 3rd Panzer started the battle with 90 vehicles. After 10 days of heavy fighting, they reported 41 operational, 49 losses total. The Soviet claim of 270 was clearly inflated. German tankers later reported that direct kills from Il-2 attacks were relatively rare. The RS-82 and RS-132 rockets were inaccurate. Hit probability against a single tank was approximately 1.1%. Even firing at a tank formation, the hit rate was only 3.7%. But what the statistics missed was the cumulative effect. An Il-2 attack disrupted operations. Tanks scattered, convoys stopped, troops took cover, communications broke down, and while German armor was paralyzed, Soviet ground forces advanced. The Il-2 wasn't just destroying tanks, it was creating chaos. By 1944, the tactics had evolved further. The defensive circle became offensive. Instead of protecting themselves from German fighters, Il-2 formations would establish their circle over a target and maintain it until the target ceased to exist. Attacks could last 90 minutes or more. Wave after wave of bombs, rockets, cannon fire. German defenders reported that the psychological effect was devastating. You could hear them coming. The distinctive sound of the Mikulin AM-38F engines. A low, droning roar that grew louder as the formation approached. Then the circle would form, and for the next hour there was no respite. One Il-2 would peel away, attack, rejoin. Another would follow, and another. German anti-aircraft crews would fire until their guns overheated, barrels glowing red. They'd shoot down 1, maybe 2 Il-2s. But 6 more kept attacking. Wehrmacht soldiers developed a dark humor about it. They called the Il-2 formations Stalin's merry-go-round. It was not a term of endearment. April 16, 1945, Cielo Heights, 50 kilometers east of Berlin, the final major defensive position before the German capital. The Wehrmacht had fortified every meter of ground. 3 defensive lines, minefields, concrete bunkers, dug-in tanks. The Soviets assembled 2.5 million men for the assault. Over 6,000 aircraft supported them. Among those aircraft, 1,200 Il-2 Sturmovix. The battle lasted 4 days. Soviet losses were staggering, over 30,000 killed. But German losses were catastrophic, over 60,000 killed or wounded. And the Il-2s played a decisive role. They struck German fortifications continuously. PTAB bomblets destroyed bunkers. Cannon fire suppressed anti-aircraft positions. Rocket attacks disrupted German attempts to reinforce the lines. By April 20th, the defenses had collapsed. Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin. Among the last Il-2 pilots to fly combat missions over the Silo Heights was Junior Lieutenant Anna Yegorova. She had flown 260 combat missions. She had been shot down and captured by the Germans in 1944. She survived a concentration camp. She was liberated by Soviet forces, and she was immediately suspected of collaboration because she had been captured. It took years before the suspicions were cleared and she received the recognition she deserved. But in April 1945, she was flying Il-2s over the final approach to Berlin. She later wrote, "The Il-2 was not a beautiful aircraft. It was not graceful, but it was honest. It did what it was built to do. It protected the pilot, it destroyed the enemy, and it brought me home." The final tally told a story that statistics alone could barely capture. Total Il-2 production, 36,183 aircraft. Combined with the successor Il-10, 42,330 aircraft total. The most produced military aircraft in aviation history. Second most produced aircraft of any kind, surpassed only by the Cessna 172. Soviet records documented 11,570 Il-2s lost in combat, approximately 30% of all Soviet aircraft losses. Luftwaffe and German anti-aircraft units claim to have shot down over 14,000 Il-2s. The numbers don't match. Both sides inflated their claims. But the basic truth remained. The Il-2 suffered horrific losses. And it didn't matter. Soviet factories built them faster than the Germans could destroy them. By 1944, Il-2s comprised 30% of all Soviet tactical combat aircraft, from 0.2% at the start of the war to 30% by the end. German intelligence officers analyzing the data drew a simple conclusion. The Soviets had achieved through industrial mass production what the Luftwaffe tried to achieve through superior technology. They had built an aircraft that could be produced quickly, flown by pilots with minimal training, and deployed in overwhelming numbers. The Il-2 wasn't the best ground attack aircraft of World War II by any technical measure. American P-47 Thunderbolts carried heavier bomb loads and flew faster. British Hawker Typhoons had more powerful rocket armament. German FW-190s were more maneuverable, but none of them were produced in the numbers the Soviets achieved with the Il-2, and none of them had the psychological impact. In the post-war interrogations, Wehrmacht soldiers and Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly cited the Il-2 as one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. More feared than the T-34 tank, more feared than the Katyusha rocket artillery, more feared than Soviet infantry. The Il-2 represented something the Germans hadn't anticipated: Soviet industrial capacity. When the war began, German intelligence estimated that the Soviet Union could produce perhaps 5,000 aircraft per year. In reality, Soviet factories were producing over 40,000 aircraft per year by 1944. The Il-2 was the symbol of that industrial revolution. A crude, simple, brutally effective aircraft that embodied Soviet design philosophy. Don't make it complicated, make it work, make it survive, make a lot of them. Stalin's telegram to the factory managers had called the Il-2 as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. It was more than propaganda. By 1943, Red Army commanders planning offensives assumed they would have Il-2 support. Battle plans included specific allocations. Artillery officers coordinated with Il-2 squadrons. Infantry commanders timed their assaults to coincide with Il-2 strikes. The aircraft became integrated into Soviet combined arms doctrine in ways that no other ground attack aircraft had achieved in any other military. German commanders noticed. In captured planning documents from 1944, Wehrmacht officers repeatedly warned about Il-2 formations. Expect heavy air attack. Il-2 formations active in sector. Recommend movement only at night to avoid Sturmovik strikes. The Germans adapted. They moved supplies at night. They camouflaged armor. They dug deeper fortifications. But by 1944, it was too late. The Luftwaffe couldn't contest Soviet air superiority. German industrial production couldn't match Soviet output. And the Il-2s kept coming. Oleg Rastranin, a post-war Soviet aviation historian, summarized the Il-2's impact with clinical precision. It was the most useful aircraft for our infantry and the aircraft most feared by German infantry. This is the measure of effectiveness that matters. Not speed, not range, not payload, but psychological impact on the enemy and confidence inspired in your own forces. By these measures, the Il-2 was unmatched. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of Il-2s were still in service. Many would continue flying for years afterward. Some were exported to Soviet client states. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, China, and North Korea all operated Il-2s in the late 1940s. But the rapid advancement of jet technology made them obsolete. By 1954, even the most die-hard users had retired their Sturmoviks. Most were scrapped. A few were preserved in museums. Today, only about a dozen Il-2s exist worldwide. Most are static displays, their engines silent, their armored shells testament to battles long finished. But for the men who flew them and the men who faced them, the memory remained vivid. Klaus Hartmann, the German pilot who laughed at the Il-2 in June 1941, survived the war. He spent 5 years in a Soviet prison camp. He returned to Germany in 1950. In a 1978 interview for a West German documentary about the Eastern Front, he was asked about the aircraft he remembered most clearly. He didn't hesitate. The Il-2, we shot down hundreds of them. They kept coming. We mocked them at first, called them flying tractors, concrete planes. But by 1943, we weren't mocking anymore. We were afraid. Not of one Il-2, one we could handle, but they never came alone. 8, 10, 12 at a time. And when you heard that formation approaching, when you saw them establish their circle above your position, you knew what was coming. You couldn't run. You couldn't hide. You just had to endure it. And hope you survived. Most didn't. The Il-2 Sturmovik revealed something about warfare that technology alone could not predict. Industrial capacity mattered more than individual aircraft performance. Sustainability mattered more than sophistication. And psychological impact mattered as much as physical destruction. The Germans had the better pilots, the better aircraft, the better tactics in 1941. But by 1945, none of that mattered. The Soviets had more pilots, more aircraft, more factories. They had the Il-2, and they had time to learn how to use it. From the clumsy, vulnerable single-seaters of 1941 to the feared formations of 1945, the Il-2's evolution paralleled the Soviet Union's transformation from desperate defender to unstoppable attacker. Total production, 36,183 aircraft. Total cost, approximately 35 billion rubles in 1940s currency. Cost per unit, roughly 1 million rubles, about half the cost of a comparable German ground attack aircraft. The mathematics was brutal but decisive. For every German aircraft destroyed, the Soviets could build 3 Il-2s. For every German pilot killed, the Soviets trained 5 Il-2 pilots. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, war of materiel, and they lost it. In 2010, aviation archaeologists discovered a crashed Il-2 in a Russian forest. The aircraft had gone down in 1943. The pilot had survived, been rescued, but the aircraft remained where it fell for 67 years. When they excavated it, they found the armor shell largely intact. Bullet holes showed where German fighters had struck it. 23 holes in the tail section, 7 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. None had penetrated the armoured tub. The Mikulin engine was seized, but remarkably well preserved. The 23mm cannons were still in their mounts, and in the cockpit they found the pilot's logbook. Water damaged, barely legible, but readable. The final entry, dated July 19, 1943, read, Mission 47, target, German armour near Oboyan. Result, 3 vehicles destroyed, aircraft hit multiple times, return to base. This plane has saved my life 6 times. I will fly it again tomorrow. The Il-2 Sturmovik was never the most advanced aircraft of World War II. It was never the fastest, the most maneuverable, or the most heavily armed. But it was the most essential. Stalin called it as necessary as air and bread. German soldiers called it Black Death. Soviet pilots called it Ilyushin, with the same affection a soldier might have for a reliable weapon or a trusted companion. And when the war ended, when historians began tallying the factors that led to Soviet victory on the Eastern Front, the Il-2 was always near the top of the list. Not because any single Il-2 changed the course of the war, but because 36,000 of them did. Klaus Hartmann's laughter on June 27, 1941, had lasted approximately 30 seconds. By July 1943, he wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were. The tin planes ruled the skies, and the Wehrmacht learned too late that mockery was no defense against 36,000 armored attackers that refused to die, refused to die, refused to die, refused to die, refused to die.